microstructure project. My name's Anna. I'm an intern at the Cold Regions Laboratory this summer and the project lead for this week. Hackweek brought together this team of all unique affiliations, and together we took a dive into some microstructure questions using micro-CT, integrating sphere, and SMP data from the SnowEx Grand Mesa campaign. And with that, I'll hand it to Mike.
I can do this part, but I think Mel was going to, yeah?
Oh, sorry, Mel.
Okay, so what we were interested in is the fact that the microstructure controls the remote sensing response to from all sorts, at whatever wavelength you're looking at, from visible through to radar microwave frequencies. Traditionally, there's been 4 ways that we can measure microstructure: penetrometer, which we'll be referring to as SMP. We've got integrating sphere, which is based on optical reflectance techniques, and then finally X-ray tomography, which we refer to as micro-CT, otherwise known as CAT scan. However, there are trade-offs between the particular methods you use. So we've got this little schematic here in the middle. So the traditional grain size is kind of slow to take and also not very accurate. The SMP, on the other hand, is very quick, but there are some issues with interpreting the microstructure from it. But we think that we can develop this to be much more accurate. So that's what we've been working on this week. So we have integrating sphere, which sits somewhere in the middle, and then we've got micro-CT, which is high accuracy, but it's very slow and complicated to make. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the questions we had this week and what we're trying to achieve, we're trying to understand the consistency between different ways of calculating the specific surface area, or SSA, another name for the snow grain size, which we also can translate to the equivalent sphere diameter, if you like to think of sphere scatterers. So there's different methods of retrieving SSA from micro-CT, so we wanted to look into the consistency in doing that. We also wanted to compare the observations from IceCube instrument taken during SnowEx with the micro-CT, and also looking at the SMP observations, firstly how they are, and recalibrating them to see if we can get higher accuracy from them. So what we had in mind at the start of the week, we really wanted to derive specific surface area from roughly 1,000 SMP profiles, so spread all across the Grand Mesa. And I think we even talked about linking this up to microwave scattering and looking at SWESAR. But you'll see how far we got. We kind of slightly narrowed our scope and just comparing at certain pits where we have very good observations. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about micro-CT, and then Mike will talk about the integrating sphere, and then Robbie will talk about the SMP. So just briefly, if you're not familiar with micro-CT or X-ray tomography or CAT scan, so this is a way of imaging with X-rays the 3D microstructure of the snow. So you can see the figure on the left, on the right, kind of illustrates a column of that taken during SnowEx. We often think of this as the gold standard description of microstructure because we know it in 3 dimensions. It's very detailed, you get very high resolution results. However, it's really not an easy measurement to make. It's not always casted in the field, but sometimes it is. So you pour diethyl phthalate and it fills all those voids, and you keep it super cold and ship it to a cold lab where you can start to slice through and determine the microstructure. So it is time consuming to make these observations, and also there are quite a lot of sampling decisions you have to make. For example, the resolution of your scans and all sorts of things, and so if in the image here you can see it's kind of some of it's black, some of it's white, and some of it's grey. So where do you place that boundary between black and white, essentially? So go to the next slide, please? Okay, so these are some samples that were taken at pit 2N13. So basically, a series of subsamples were taken, samples taken, and these were taken to the lab and then sliced further. So basically, I think the snow pit was something like 1.40 meters, so it's broken down into chunks and then shipped. So for an example, the top two images, the one on the left is kind of the whole sample. And where I've drawn that red line, it's not exactly there, but the slice on the right is kind of a 2D cross section of that. So you can see white is where the ice is and black is where the air is. There were some issues with some of the samples. So on the bottom, you can see kind of a partial sample. And when you start slicing it, you're only seeing a very tiny section of that microstructure. So there are some issues in terms of processing these data. But overall, we have a lot of data. We have over 65,000 of these images on the right to analyze. So that's what we did. Okay, and the next slide, please. Thank you. So first thing to do is to crop this. So we've got the 2D image here, kind of in the middle on the top, and crop that so we're excluding all of the area outside of that circle of the core. So that's shown by the image on the right, and then you scan up and down and across side to side to determine the autocorrelation function. So that is roughly the probability of being either in ice or air as you go a certain distance from the point you started at. So the correlation function looks like something like the bottom middle. So you can see that the correlation drops as a function of distance as you go. If you start within an ice crystal, close by, you're likely to be in ice, but as you go further away, you're less likely to be in ice. Now, the point, the blue spot there, so the value of the autocorrelation function at the origin is related purely to the ice volume fraction F2 or snow density. However, the slope of the correlation function, that red line there, at the origin is related to both the density, so the fractional volume F2, but also the snow specific surface area SSA. So this is how we actually calculate SSA from that binary image there. So we reprocess those 65,000 samples, and on the next slide, we have just the autocorrelation function plotted for that particular section. So we know we can derive SSA right at the origin. However, the correlation also varies as a function of distance. So everything that measures snow specific surface area is telling you something right to that origin. It's telling you about the small scale scattering, whereas microwave scattering is actually sensitive to that longer tail. And you can see here the exponential correlation function, those solid lines there, they don't fit so well towards the tail of the correlation function. So the squares and spots. So really the question is, how do the different techniques that we're investigating as part of this project compare at the small scale? So one final slide on the micro CT, because this was already processed as part of the SnowEx project. The method used in the SnowEx project, so that was done by Lauren, sorry, Mike,
Farnsworth, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Farnsworth, perfect. So yeah, Lauren analysed these but she used a different technique. So it's the specific surface area is a measure of the surface area to volume ratio. So the method she used was picking out objects and then calculating that surface area to volume ratio, whereas the technique we've used as part of this project is based on the autocorrelation function. So the object-based technique is shown in blue, and our reprocessing for this project is shown in the grey. And we were hugely surprised that these actually, well, they were very, very similar. So we were delighted that these methods are quite comparable. So then this gives us some confidence in this particular, the way we're processing these data. So then the question is, how do the micro CT observations of SSA or equivalent diameter compare with other field techniques? So I'll hand over to Mike.
Thanks. We wanted to compare these to the integrating sphere. The integrating sphere is a laser-based method that you make in a snow pit. So it's fairly accurate and it's fairly quick, but it does have to be done in a snow pit. We have about 100 of these, and we over the entire mesa, and we're going to compare at 5 pits where we also have CT. Next slide. This is what the comparison looks like. Five snow pit profiles, 2N13, which Mel was just talking about. It's there in the bottom left. Our basic conclusion from looking at consistency here was that the agreement is not bad. 2N13 had kind of scared me because you see a sort of exaggerated pattern of the issue you see elsewhere, where the equivalent diameters from the integrating sphere are less than the CT. So it's a consistent less than. And then the final note on performance across these 5, which is not a huge sample size, but we're starting to see a persistent pattern of the top layers being more underestimated than the bottom layers. But overall, was fairly happy with this. Next slide. Here is the relative difference. So the error or the difference between the integrating sphere and CT normalized by the equivalent diameter in the CT. So the relative difference you can see on the histogram on the left has a significant bias, right? So if it was unbiased, you'd have that whole histogram shifted to the left, but because of the bias, you do see that pattern. And then on the right, you can see how that relative difference is a function of the equivalent grain size. And so one thing that's encouraging when you look at those larger grains, mostly corresponding to the faceted parts of the pack, things are starting to approach being fairly unbiased. All right, and so this was fairly encouraging. And so from SMP, from the integrating sphere work, then we start looking at the SMP.
So the snow micropin measures the force required to break snow microstructure, and the great thing about this method is that it's really fast, but as we talked about before, the relationship to derived SSA estimates aren't quite accurate yet. So the work that we did in this project that Robbie's going to talk over is exploring the coefficients that are used to derive the SSA, and to compare these SSA estimates to those that were made by the micro CT. And with that, I'll hand it over to Robbie. Oh, actually, a quick note on the snow micropen air and ground detection. So the uploaded SMP data is raw penetration force profiles. The snow micropin library gives some surface and ground detection functions to help take out these air and to distinguish the ground. But upon comparing that snow micropin detection function to actual depths from field notes from the Grand Mesa data, we see that it's typically pretty good at finding this surface, that red line there, but the ground detection is a little more involved. In this first plot, we see that ground detection, which is the green and the purple, are exactly the same, and that's what we really want to see. And then in the second plot, the reason why the field notes depth is a little bit further is because the SMP gets set to a certain depth of investigation. And so even though that depth of the snow profile is deeper, the SMP didn't fully capture it. And then finally, in this last one is just a good example of the field notes coming in handy, where the field notes show a different ground depth from that of that function that we talked about. And this is dependent on that surface detection function being correct. But upon talking to Megan Mason, this might be translated into a level 1 release of data on the NSIDC. So with that, I will now hand it over to Robbie.
So a big part of the project that we wanted to do was to recalibrate these coefficients, and a few different authors have put forward coefficients based on different field campaigns. But Grand Mesa obviously has quite distinct properties relative to to perhaps the French Alps or sea ice or snow in Antarctica, which have all been used to make different calibrations. One relevant thing we sort of had to think about was version 4 of the SMP was used for SnowEx, which has slightly different firmware and a different chip. And Neige Cologne at Meteo France did a really nice job of showing that does actually make a difference to the coefficients that you want to use. So there's lots of different stuff flying around, and we thought, why don't we just try and make a set of coefficients for Grand Mesa in 2020. So next slide, please. This is what it looks like when you. So I should say that the foundation for this investigation was we had 4 snow pits with micro-CT data, and we decided to consider micro-CT as the gold standard for SSA calculation. And each of those pits had 3 SMP profiles done right next to the pit. So we considered those, and we displayed them on this plot where red is the traditional, if you like, coefficients, and blue is a more recent set of coefficients that were calibrated in the French Alps. And you can see actually that the more traditional coefficients have worked a lot better to capture that black dashed line that comes from the micro-CT. So that was a pretty interesting finding. And we thought, well, can we do even better than these calibrations from Proc et al. 2015? Next slide, please. So the method we took was we started out with the Neige Cologne 2020 coefficients, because those are theoretically better for version 4, and we thought let's tweak those until we find some that have the lowest error with regard to the micro-CT. And we did that for each SMP profile, and there's 3 of those for each of the 4 pits that we investigated. Next slide, please. And this is what happened. So we found that all 12 SMP profiles that we considered, this like minimization exercise kind of converged away from the Cologne 2020 coefficients, and they were generally higher, and that's related to the fact that there's just a fixed bias that we found in the Cologne coefficients relative to the micro-CT that we saw in SnowEx. But the grouping was quite pleasing. It doesn't really matter which SMP you take from SnowEx 2020, they all lead to the same rough coefficients that are the best fit. Next slide, please. And this is the RMSE. So for reference, the RMSE of the Proc was like 9, and I think the RMSE of the Cologne coefficients was about 15. So the RMSE can really go quite low when you tune these parameters. So I'm sure some people would argue that we're actually overfitting, and we've made our parameters way too specific, and they wouldn't apply elsewhere. But I mean, that's kind of the game we're playing. So we just picked the lowest one, which is the middle bar of the set of blue bars for Snow Pit 2S16, and we just applied those to all of the pits and checked out how it went. So next slide, please, Anna. So the green is the performance of our optimized coefficients in retrieving this specific surface area of snow. And as you can see, it works pretty well. It does a better job of the blue line, certainly the 2020 coefficients. And it also does quite a lot better than the red line at some of the pits. So if you look at 2N13 in the bottom right, if you look at the equivalent grain size, the bottom right panel, the green line does a much better job of following that black dashed line than either the red or the blue line. And that's for coefficients derived from another snow pit, from the top left snow pit, in fact. So that's kind of a nice result, I guess.
We're a couple minutes over, Robbie.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I'm done on this. I'm done now.
All right, so just to wrap up, thanks to Hackweek, we're going to continue working together, and Mel is hopefully going to integrate this work into an AGU talk. And we're even thinking about down the road trying to put together a paper on how microstructure controls the remote sensing response, potentially using SWISAR. So thank you, everyone, for a great Hackweek, and thanks for listening to this talk.